Greetings, I'm Shad, the Longsword. Probably one of the more misunderstood swords thanks to many misconceptions that have arisen due to pop culture and stuff. Now, I might be seeming to bag pop culture, but I'm a pop culture nut. I love it all. But I love swords as well, and it pains me when I see them mistreated, even though they're inanimate objects without feelings. It pains me nonetheless. Now, in my video, which explains the sword names and terminology, I mentioned that there's a bit of confusion as to where the longsword fits in the large scheme of things. And I explained that the longsword is, in fact, the two-handed sword that most people would be familiar with. When they think of a greatsword, they're actually, in fact, thinking of a longsword. The swords in Skyrim, Dungeons & Dragons that show two-handed swords, they're actually this size. Now, there is a bit of confusion for medievalists like myself as to when a sword stops becoming one type of sword and starts to become another type of sword. A perfect example of this is indeed the short sword. Now, when you look at the short sword, you could actually kind of think of it as a very large dagger. So, what is it? Well, looking at this, you can clearly say, yes, it's a short sword. Maybe it's the larger crossguard, but there is confusion of it, where when does a short sword become too short to become a dagger, and when does it become too long and it'll be an arming sword? Well, we're not actually here to talk about short swords because this one is harder to find, but I want to talk about long swords and great swords because, in my opinion, there is an actual line when one sword stops becoming a long sword and it is now a great sword. So on the wall here, we have two swords that are undisputably long swords. It's obvious, okay? We have the synthetic Spiring longsword here. Now that is a classic example of the standard longsword shape and size. That's a very good sword to base your measurements off. This is the standard longsword that you would find in most medieval Europe. Now, of course, there's many variations. Look at the yoke shot typology. You'll have swords with parallel edges. You'll also have swords that are fully tapered to a fine point. You'll have swords that are half tapered and then curve in at the points. You'll have swords with a different arrangement of quillins. Maybe it has ring guards. It has a different pommel. But this is the general standard. This shows what most long swords are like. And if you base it off this size, this profile, you'll be pointing yourself in the right direction. And of course we have the undisputed bastard sword. Now, the bastard sword, as we've talked about, is a subcategory of longsword. So these swords are undisputably long swords. It's when we get to this one. This sword is when we start to get the argument, the confusion. What is it? There are historical examples showing swords of this size to be long swords and swords of this size, and they are called great swords as well. It seems to be the crossover point. So how do we define the difference? We're going to look at that right now. Let's go! We're going to go into this. So a good question to ask, is it the sword profile? Is it the profile of the sword that defines what it is? I don't think so. I don't like it, but many people would look at this sword. If it had the profile of a greatsword, meaning if it had a ricasso, kind of like a third handle to hold here, and two small spiked quillins on the blade, many people say, well, that's definitely a greatsword because it looks like a greatsword. I disagree. I dispute that fact. I say size and function is what defines a sword, not the profile, and that's what misleads a lot of people. There are many swords on the market today that are indeed this size, yet they have the profile of a greatsword, and they are sold and promoted as greatswords. Well, like I said, that's the confusing thing because this is equally a longsword. There are long swords that are just as long and great swords, and it seems to be the only defining difference between them is the profile that they're in. Profile of a longsword, profile of a greatsword. Let's get into the nitty-gritty now. Now, I've mentioned that the greatsword is its own beast. It's huge. A proper greatsword is going to be up to your head height, up to your full height, if not more. But then you'll say, well, hang on, there's historical examples of it being shorter. Let's look at it. Because of the greatsword size, it necessitates a completely different style of combat and fighting. If you look at the treatises, you'll notice the style of fighting that you have with the greatsword are these big, wide, sweeping moves. They're using the momentum of the blade and swinging it around and carrying the momentum, and I'm not even going to attempt to do that in here because it's just way too small. I'll break something. And one of the reasons why you can see so many wide swings are needed, particularly outward swings, because of this. you hit the ground. The blade is so blasted long, you hit the ground. This changes the function of the sword, of this sword, completely, to the point that you don't even fight with it like a sword anymore. You can't parry with it. You can't make riposte. Like, it's too cumbersome, too big. You're not going to get away with it. Also, if you want to do low blocks, you're always hitting the ground. If you try and spin the blade back, you're like, oh, I hit the ground again. It doesn't work. So the Greatsword necessitates a completely different style of combat. You cannot fight with this like you can a regular sword. Now, other swords, their sword styles, they can be transferred between themselves. Longswords moves you can use with arming swords. Likewise, arming swords you can use with long swords. And indeed, you can even use Greatsword style moves with lower sized swords. But you can't use the Greatsword with the moves of a longsword or an arming sword because it's too big. The Greatsword is actually impossible to fight with like a regular sword. So guess what? That kind of makes it not a sword. Yes, it has the general profile of a sword. It has a blade, it has a handle, it has a big nice crossguard on it. But you're fighting with it like a polearm, especially when you start half-swording, because you can half-sword with a Greatsword, but it becomes like a quarterstaff or something like that. So, completely different. That is why you would be better off classing the Greatsword, in your mind, in your way you classify swords. You'd be better off if you didn't consider it a sword at all, because you would have a more accurate understanding of how they're used and how they're fought with. So the cutoff point I propose, where a longsword stops becoming a longsword and becomes a Greatsword, is the point where it becomes too large to be used like a sword. So when we look at this one, the confusing one, the one that seems to be both a longsword and a Greatsword, they're kind of bridging the gap. How can we classify it? Because it has been, rightly classified as a Greatsword. There are examples, like I mentioned before, and rightly classified as a longsword. Well, if we look at it, how you can fight with it. Yes, you can use it like a Greatsword. Indeed, a longer blade would be more advantageous if you're using Greatsword moves. That's what they're meant for. But you can also use it like a longsword. And a Greatsword, in my mind, in my opinion, is a sword that's too big to be used like a sword. So if this sword can still be used like a sword, that means it is still a sword. Therefore, it's a longsword, not a Greatsword. I find there are 3 very practical and perfect rules of thumb that help you define this. Now, granted, they will change between the size of the person using it, but they give a very good definition and point of reference, or a cutoff point, where a longsword stops becoming a sword. And I actually built this one to be as big as it possibly could before it crossed this line. So these are my 3 rules of thumb. Rule of thumb number 1, that defines where this line is. Can you draw it from a scabbard at your hip? Just. You see this? Just. Any longer and I couldn't do it. But because I can, well, guess what? I can still use it like a sword. So let's try the first rule of thumb with a Greatsword. It's not going to work. Rule of thumb number 2. When holding the sword in a standard stance, you can move the sword down without moving your hand and it doesn't touch the ground. If you can make this sword completely horizontal and move it like this and it's not touching the ground, it is still a sword. Indeed, it is still a long sword. Let's try the second rule of thumb with a Greatsword. Yeah, that's going to make the wide articulation that you often use in longsword styles very difficult. Rule of thumb number 3. When releasing the sword, you can extend your hand past the blade to grapple or grab someone and then do nice stabby things to them. Yeah. Yep. Let's try this with a Greatsword. Alright, I can just get it past, but I'm not holding the blade as strong as I can, and like for me to get it past, I need to hold it with 2 fingers, get my hand fully there to get it past. And now, I'm not holding the blade, I'm not holding the handle with any form of strong grip. I could be disarmed very easily like that. So if I'm going to keep a proper grip, no, this is as far as I get, and the blade is extending. It's not working. So they are my 3 rules of thumb. They're the guiding line or measuring stick as to when a longsword stops becoming a longsword and necessitates being used like a greatsword, because you can't in fact use it like any other sword. The sad thing I find about this, and I think these rules of thumb work well. I think they work well in a historical context, and there are many historical examples of greatswords being the proper size that necessitate the style of fighting that you find in the treatises that explain greatsword fighting. What upsets me is that they're very hard to buy. The reproductions, and like the good ones that are made out of proper good steel, guess what size they often are? This. They have the greatsword profile, they've got a ricasso, quillins, but they're this size, they're puny, they are the size of longswords. They are in fact longswords. They're not greatswords at all, for the very reasons that I explained just previously. The perfect example of a modern reproduction, high quality, made of really good steel sword that falls into this error, I should say, yes, falls into this terrible error, is the sword produced by Cold Steel. Go to Cold Steel and have a look at their greatsword online, and you will find people standing next to it like this, and for a greatsword, it's puny. That thing's not a greatsword. They're selling it like greatsword, but that is a longsword, most definitely. You can fight with it like a longsword, you can use it with a longsword, you can draw it from a sheath, you can reverse your grip so it doesn't touch the ground, and you can also use one-handed moves, fully extending past the blade. It's a longsword. It is not a greatsword. You are not forced to fight with it like a greatsword because of its size. Other examples of swords that are sold as greatswords, but are indeed longswords, are what I feel, even the greatswords from Albion, looking at photos and sizes. And look, I haven't done extensive research. They might have a newer model that's even larger, but I didn't find one that was proper greatsword size, in my opinion. And even the synthetic Spiring greatswords that are sold are, again, this size. They're long swords. If you really want to fight or use a greatsword and get the feeling of what it's like to use a greatsword, and one of the main ways you'll be able to do this is to get a sword so big that it has to be used the way greatswords are used, because it's too big to be used in any other way. You need a greatsword of proper size. You won't get the same feeling, you won't learn the same things that you want to by using a longsword like a greatsword. Now I should mention, there are of course exceptions to the rule. There are swords in greatsword profile that are this big, that are historical examples, that are indeed called greatswords. So what I might be doing here is proposing a new form of classification that helps us more understand which sword belongs in which category, because it's defined by size and function, not profile. So there you have it. I hope I've cleared up some confusion, and we can very rightly take the sword, this mid-sword between longsword and greatsword, and put it where it rightly belongs, with the longswords. These 3 are longswords, and they're great representations because you have the classic size, which is very common, and then you have the largest extreme, the biggest extreme that you can go to in longsword sizes, and the smallest. And then you get to see the range of what they came in. And I would hope that we can understand a bit more about the greatsword as well, specifically how they're used with the big, wide, sweeping movements, which are necessary because of their size. Now, you might be wondering, well, where were greatswords used actually in historical context? And currently we believe that they were used to break up pike formations. You can kind of see how that would be useful, because pikes, they can be huge, they can be really, really long. And so if you are running head first at this line of pikes, swinging this blade in these massively wide and broad swaths because of the length of the sword, you would be able to knock away probably a good 4 pikes from position. And then in a couple of seconds, not even a couple, maybe in half a second, you'd have the blade swing around again and again. And if you have a guy who's standing at, a good distance so your blades don't cross, doing the same thing, oh my goodness! Those pikes are screwed. They are not going to be staying in formation. So you can see that's how we believe they were used in a historical context. They were not used for self-defense. Now, when I'm saying this, there's exceptions for any rule. I'm sure some guy came along saying, this would be great for self-defense, but it's not good for self-defense. There are much better swords. It's awkward. And one of the main reasons why you wouldn't carry a self-defense is because it's just so cumbersome. It's just so big. You'll be knocking in everything as you're walking around. It's not to say that you wouldn't get certain advantages when using a greatsword over a longsword. I mean, it has greater reach. Reach is a huge advantage, but longswords are convenient. They're as big as a sword can get. They can hang at your hip. You can use like a sword. You have all the versatility that, swords are used for and famous for. And you can go about your merry day unimpeded. Whereas a greatsword, they're a polearm. It's difficult carrying a polearm around every day. So these are not weapons for self-defense. These are battlefield weapons. That's how it was used in history, or that's where we believe it has been most predominantly used. And I certainly haven't found any accounts of people using greatswords for personal defense, but hey, it probably was, 1 or 2 guys around there, but it's not a good option. So there we have it. What is a true longsword and what is a true greatsword? I hope you enjoyed. I hope we've all learned something. And please come back and watch other stuff that I make if you feel so inclined.